Hello ARRL members and QST readers. I'm Dave Kassler, amateur radio call sign KE0OG. This video accompanies the Ask Dave column in the November 2021 issue of QST. One of the questions is about splatter, which is when an improperly adjusted transmitter sprays extraneous RF over adjacent channels. In this video, we'll look at the waterfall diagram of a splattering station, and then I'll dig out my 1970s era Yaesu FT101B and purposely cause it to splatter so we can get a better idea of what's going on and how we can avoid generating it ourselves. Before I dig into that, let me note that I tried hard to get my ICOM 7300, a modern radio, to splatter, but I couldn't. It has circuits inside to properly limit RF emissions to the 3 kHz bandwidth of a single sideband station. I put the radio on my dummy load and did my best to make it splatter while watching the transmitted spectrum on my SDR Play RSP-1A radio using the house brand SDR Uno software. No maladjustment would make it splatter. This is goodness, although overdriving the microphone gain and the compression will make the signal sound pretty lousy. This is not true of older rigs, and by that I mean radios built more than, say, about 40 years ago. There are still plenty in operation, and the Yaesu FT101B you see sitting on the shelf behind me is about 45 years old. It still works. Okay, first, let's take a look at some splatter I recorded off the air today on the 40-meter band. It was a freewheeling discussion on a variety of topics, and someone jumped in to add a comment. Let's look at his signal on the waterfall. We see that his signal is supposed to be on the same frequency as the signal below it, to which he was replying. Now, we're using lower sideband here as it's on 40 meters, so the signal's suppressed carrier is above the rest of the signal. The splatterer's signal audio frequencies go down and out of band, so if there were an adjacent signal there, it would be subject to interference. And there's no good reason to put RF energy there either, because the person he's talking to can't receive those higher audio frequencies, being limited to a 3 kHz bandwidth as is proper. Further, the splatterer is putting out energy on the upper sideband where there should be none. If there is an adjacent signal just above this conversation in frequency, this splatter would interfere with that station, and the intended recipient cannot hear this extra emission because he's listening on the lower sideband in the proper channel. So, the splatter that comes out of the station subtracts from the overall energy that the listener can hear and also interferes with stations on adjacent frequencies. This is definitely not best practice. Interestingly, I was able to hear the splattering station on my 7300. Now, my 7300 was not receiving the splatter itself, but just the audio that did make through the radio's audio circuits. It made pretty good sense. It was distorted, but the audio through the 7300 was acceptable. It's a shame that the station wasted power on splatter because it actually makes the signal that I could hear weaker. Now let's turn to our experiment. What I have here is a 45-year-old radio, a Yaesu FT101B. This radio is important in ham radio history because this series of radios, both by Kenwood and Yaesu, were among the first of the Japanese 100-watt transceivers. However, being an old radio, using old technologies and tubes for the drivers and finals, can be misadjusted to the point where they will create splatter. Let's do that. I'm going to cut to the recording that I made of the spectrum analyzer that shows a few kilohertz either side of the radio's transmit frequency. Then we will cut to a recording made looking at the splattering signal on my SDR Play software-defined radio. Note that this old radio has a knob that says carrier. Today we would call that power. It is possible to adjust the power so that it is too high, and we will see what happens when we do that. Let's take a look. It's quite interesting. Okay, we're looking at the spectrum analyzer, and I'm going to transmit on 14150. Now let's take a look at some of these here. The starting frequency is 14140, and the stop frequency is 14160. So we're going to be transmitting somewhere down here, and you'll see that, again, this is a logarithmic scale, so you'll see the actual signal there. So if I talk into this, you can see that most of the signal is contained in this little area right here. You get a little bit of noise down here, but that's normal, and many dB down. Okay, now let me turn the carrier up. Okay, I've turned the carrier up, and whoa, look at that. A lot of the stuff that is going out of band is showing up over here where it shouldn't be. And this signal is definitely splattering. It's taking up more than its allotted space in the spectrum. We'll go back now to just a reasonable carrier, and you see that the thing is well behaved. Okay, and then we turn the carrier up, and you see that it picks up all kinds of additional components in there. This just goes to show that old radios need to be properly tuned. Hello, hello, hello. This is a very old transceiver. It's the Yaesu FT101B. And you'll note that it gives a very nice upper sideband signal here. Now I'm going to deliberately raise the carrier level, and we'll see what happens. Hello, we are operating with a much higher carrier level than we should, and you'll see the splatter into the opposite sideband here. And also the bandwidth gets a little bit larger, and that will interfere with people who are using that band. Here it is all the way up, and you can see that the machine is splattering terribly. Again, this is a 1970s era radio and does not have the circuits in it that will keep it from splattering. So there you have it. Splatter comes from overdriving your transmitter. This can happen on older radios if you try to push too much power through it, or misadjust the audio to the point where it distorts. The effects of splatter are, first, that energy is transmitted outside the intended bandwidth where it can interfere with other conversations. Second, it wastes transmit power by throwing it outside the intended signal bandwidth, and it also introduces audio distortion. So what's the best way to avoid splatter in your own signal? The answer's simple. Take a look at the instruction manual and set up the radio so that it is putting out a very nice signal. Also, you can talk to a nearby ham who has a waterfall display in his radio, and he can tell you if you are transmitting outside your normal bandwidth. It's interesting that a splattering station is counterproductive. The ham trying for maximum signal is actually losing signal out of band. So if you're trying to get a hold of the DX station or contest stations, you are actually reducing the power that your recipient can hear. The thing to remember is that although relatively recent radios, such as introduced within the last 10 years, mostly don't splatter, some of that really cool vintage gear can certainly do so, and do so easily. If you monitor your own signal on a software-defined radio, such as the SDR Play or similar, you can readily see if you are splattering. The thing to do is cut back on either the power or the microphone gain until you have a nice signal. You also need to make sure that your compression is set correctly. You'll probably have better luck with this signal because it's easier to understand. Also, you are not interfering with your fellow hams. I hope this was useful and is a supplement to what was in QST. You can submit questions to this column by sending them to AskDave, all one word, at arrl.org. Or you can submit questions to hamradioanswers, all one word, at gmail.com. Until we next meet, 73.